Now tell us about sort of the economics of this and how you qualify, how you qualify a potential commercial customer. Can you describe for us what is the ideal commercial solar owner look like and what kind of a payback can they expect?
The types of companies I would target are tightly held, privately owned companies.
What should a solar sales rep expect in terms of the sales process, timeline, commission structure, commission potential? How does that differ on the commercial and industrial side? All right, welcome back to the Solar Surge podcast. Hey, if you're new to the Solar Surge podcast, on this program, we meet with the top CEOs and the top thought leaders in the solar and energy storage space. And in today's episode, I have a special guest for you. Tim Montague is the creator and host of the Clean Power Hour podcast. Tim is a solar and storage developer, a solar and storage expert, coach, and consultant with over 30 years of experience in technology, sustainability, and triple bottom line business. Tim has helped dozens of technology entrepreneurs and businesses grow and create a positive impact. His motto is, let's grow solar in storage. So Tim, it's really great to see you again. Welcome to the Solar Surge podcast.
Thanks, Joe. Longtime listener, first time caller. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm really a big fan of the work that you've been doing over at Clean Power Hour. But I guess for those of you or for those in the audience that aren't familiar with you, can you give a little bit about your background? How did you first get started in the solar industry?
Yeah, energy is in my blood, Joe. I grew up doing solar thermal in my backyard, meaning hot water panels and solar cookers. I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where there's obviously lots of sunshine. But PV wasn't on the scene when I was a kid, and this was in the 70s, although the technology dates to the 50s. It wasn't until 2016 that a gentleman named Paul Johnson cold called me kind of out of the blue. And he found my number on LinkedIn, and he was growing a consumer to consumer solar company called Crew at the time. And he said, Tim, we've reached grid parity with solar. And I was like, awesome, let's go. And I was fishing around or casting about, as I say, for my next big thing. And it was PV. I quickly found a contractor in Chicago called Continental Energy Solutions is their name today, and they're a fantastic solar installer for commercial solar. I was only really interested in B2B. That's my expertise. I've been a B2B sales and marketer, sales professional and marketing professional my whole career. And so solar PV was a homecoming, but I was fairly late to the game. And that's one of my few regrets, Joe, is not getting into solar right out of college, which I probably could have done because I went to UC San Diego and many of the early solar companies come out of California.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because although maybe you're late to the game compared to some of us, I mean, I think the solar industry is finally becoming mainstream now, and so I think although we have dealt with a few bumps in the road over the past couple of years, particularly on the residential side, I think we're in a solid position to grow now, and the industry and the technology is really maturing, which is nice to see.
Yeah, that word mature is relative, right? I saw a news story this morning that clean tech is going to invest as much as fossil fuel energy sources or technologies in the world in 2025 for the first time. And so while the energy transition has been going on for a while, it's still very early days. We have a long runway. We've only cleaned about 10 to 15% of the grid. And of course, that varies tremendously from market to market. But I like to say we have 30 years of pure growth ahead of us. So if you're not in solar, get into it.
So Tim, what inspired you to create the Clean Power Hour and get into podcasting and content creation?
Yeah, content creation is also in my blood. My dad is a journalist and writer by trade. He was also a professor and an environmental justice activist, an environmental activist. But I learned when I was, in my 30s that I'm really not a great writer. It just didn't come naturally to me. But when podcasting came onto the scene, I gravitated to that. I started a tech show in 2013 called CU150, which was a a news roundup. And then when I went to Continental, I started a webinar, which morphed into the podcast that we know today as the Clean Power Hour. So I've been podcasting in solar for the last 9 years, and it's just a great way to stay on top of things, meet interesting people. I mean, many of my guests are people that I would just never meet, like Jigger Shah, who's been on the show 3 times. He's the head of the Loan Program Office. He grew up in Illinois. He is one of the better known solar entrepreneurs, right? He created the first modern PPA for the solar industry in the United States with the company Sun Edison. And so people like that, getting to meet them and hang out and learn their story and tell their story to others is just tremendously valuable.
That's great. That's great. And, I think it's something that our industry definitely needs more of. I know you're one of the better known guys on the commercial and industrial side of the business. A lot of what we cover on Solar Surge has to do more with the residential side of the solar industry. But Tim, that's one of the things I really wanted to dig in with you today is, as the industry is transitioning and sort of adjusting to the new environment, some of the things we've dealt with in the residential side, the loss of 1-for-1 net metering in many markets, particularly in California, the introduction of battery storage and higher battery storage attachment rates, and the complexity that comes along with that. Contractors have had to deal with some of those challenges as well. But what I'd like to do is spend some time talking about for solar industry professionals that are thinking about making the transition from residential to commercial and industrial, what they need to know, what you'd like to share with them. And I'd like to hit it from a couple of different angles as well, like how do you market commercial projects? How do you sell? What is the sales process like? And who are the stakeholders? And then as far as the physical part of it as well, how do you manage the installation? And then, after installation, ongoing O&M. So I guess let's start on the marketing side of things, since we're talking about content creation. What do you need to know, first starting marketing or looking at opportunities in commercial and industrial solar?
Yeah, I think about becoming a beacon of good information. Facility owners that's your target audience. If you're a commercial solar installer, your audience is owner occupied facilities and maybe developers, right? Who are building large C&I and community solar. Those two groups, facility owners and developers, became our bread and butter at Continental. When I came to Continental, we were 3 people in the office. We had an army of electricians because we were a big electrical contractor. And so I quickly realized, wow, we need to put information in the market. And that takes many forms. The webinar, which morphed into the podcast, was one of those. And then we would repurpose each episode as a blog post, right? So we're putting written word content on our website. We're speaking at trade organizations, like there's a manufacturers association in Northern Illinois. Illinois has a lot of manufacturing, food processing, plastics, metal processing, making parts, machining, the auto industry. And so going deeper into some of these segments was a way for us to rub shoulders with these industries that had large electrical loads and large flat roofs. Those are some of the things you're looking for. And so I always encourage my customers who are installers, many of them both residential and commercial installers, who are growing into large C&I, because it's apples and oranges. Resi is so B2C, right? You're dealing with consumers. It's like buying a car, buying a residential solar system, $25,000 to $50,000. Commercial could be 50,000 at the very, very small end, and then up to 5 million and sometimes more. And so the CapEx is a much bigger thing. And ultimately, you have to reach the decision makers, the owners, the CEOs, the CFOs, the COOs. The facilities guy or manager could be a foot in the door, but they're not a decision maker. And so how you meet those people and ultimately befriend them and win their business, really, there's no one path, right? Some people are members of country clubs. I know a very successful salesperson in Northern Illinois who uses his country club connections, because there's a lot of executives from companies that have big flat roofs in his country club. And that's his main networking opportunity, so to speak. But finding face-to-face networking opportunities could be your local chamber of commerce, could be a roofing association. I try to be creative and find things that work for me and I know are going to reach the target audience. There's no one formula or or menu, but it's this series of things, and then I just think that you have to recognize that this is a marathon. You can't just expect results overnight. You got to keep on week in, week out. And that's why I've been very dogged about creating regular content on a weekly basis, sometimes 2 times a week. And I've done that consistently now for 9 years, and it has paid off so much.
That's great. And yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, when you put content out there, literally anybody in the world, anybody in the industry can meet you, can connect with you, and to some extent, and you can start building trust and rapport that way. I know that's a big part of our philosophy here at Solar Surge is we want to provide the marketplace, and particularly consumers, residential consumers in the marketplace, so much value through free content that by the time it is time to do business or go shopping, that there's a trust level, a comfort level of working with us. Now, I'm curious, do you find that the majority of your commercial solar leads are generated through consumers of your content, or is it these other more face-to-face marketing opportunities that you mentioned?
Well, I am no longer in project development. I will consult on projects with my clients, but I can speak for my past success and then what's working for my clients. And it is a both and, I like to say. I've won opportunities doing digital door knocking using Sales Navigator, which is a feature within LinkedIn. In the residential space, door knocking is quite common in some markets where you're just going door to door and trying to get a conversation going with a homeowner and selling them a project. And you can do that on LinkedIn with a premium subscription to Sales Navigator for $100 a month. And then you can plug that into a research tool called Apollo, which will help you find email addresses and phone numbers for those C-suite executives that you're trying to connect with. And that absolutely does work. Being a thought leader for sure is going to create a faster path to trust, right? People do business with people they like and trust at the end of the day. And this is true in B2C and B2B. But when a company is going to part with, say, $500,000 to $5 million, right, they want to make sure that they're doing a project with somebody who has the legs to get it done. So they're looking for a track record. And how do you convince them that you have the track record? Well, you build a marketing document called an SOQ, a statement of qualifications. And that might not be an expression you use so much in the residential space, but it's absolutely a must have. And I can send you an example if you reach out to me on LinkedIn of what I mean by an SOQ. You can also just Google it. But it's a brochure, and it documents your experience, your team, what associations are you active in, are your installers NABCEP certified? And I do feel strongly about NABCEP. I don't know if you've talked about NABCEP on the show, but it really is the gold standard in the solar industry. North American Board Certified Energy Practitioners, what that stands for. I hold the technical sales certification, but there's PVIP installation professional, there's design professional, etc. So it's, at the end of the day, Joe, it is a handshake, right? People have to trust you. But I also leaned heavily on my ownership, right, to build that trust and build relationships, because maybe my client didn't like me as much as my boss or my boss's boss. But so it was kind of a team effort in terms of finding an angle and finding a connection between Continental and the host company that was going to buy a project.
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Now tell us about sort of the economics of this and how you qualify, a potential commercial customer. Can you describe for us what is the ideal commercial solar owner look like, and what kind of a payback can they expect?
Yeah, the payback, of course, varies from market to market. If energy is very cheap and you don't have good net metering laws and you don't have specific solar incentives, the payback period might be 15 years in the United States. And that was the case here in Illinois before we got our renewable energy credit program, which was funded through FEJA, the Future Energy Jobs Act, and then CEJA, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. But in Illinois, for example, now with with those programs and the bolstered ITC that the IRA created, right? I know you've talked about this, energy communities, low income adders for domestic content. You can get to 60% ITC. You can also leverage, for example, REAP grants, which would pay for today in 2025 up to 25% of a project's value. So if you're working in rural communities, check out the REAP grant opportunity. That is a Department of Agriculture program. And so in Illinois, you could see a 4 to 6 year payback period on a commercial project with the incentives that we have in Illinois. And then the types of companies I would target are tightly held, privately owned companies. The decision-making process is just going to be so much faster and efficient in a tightly held, privately owned company, as opposed to a publicly traded Fortune 500 company like an Amazon. The Amazons and Walmarts and Targets and other Walmarts of the world are absolutely doing solar projects, and we installed portfolios of Walmarts and Targets and IKEAs and Amazons at Continental. And so it was a both and, right? But those opportunities were mostly brought to us through developers who had won RFPs and then were offering PPAs, commercial PPAs to those off-takers. And so it's kind of apples and oranges. You've got that world of the Fortune 500 big box phenomenon, and there is work there, but it's with the Summit Ridges of the world, not the Amazon. Jeff Bezos isn't signing off on a commercial project in Illinois. And so I'm looking for a factory that is privately owned and where I can sit down across the table in their conference room next to the CEO's office with the CEO, the CFO, and the COO. And that's really how you get those deals moving, is getting buy-in and finding a champion. This is mission critical. Everybody likes to save money, and you will get a lot of nodding heads on a solar project because of if the finances are good and the ROI is good and the payback period is relatively short. But if you don't have a champion, it could easily just sit on the shelf because there's so many things that could compete, Joe, with that CapEx expenditure if they're buying a solar project. And it's not that they're going to necessarily spend $500,000 or $5 million, but financing it, that definitely impacts their business. And there's a lot of things that they could do with those resources. They could do R&D. They could buy equipment. They could expand their facility. They could hire people. And that is one of the big differences, I think, in commercial versus residential, that there's so many other things that compete for the resources that the company has. And then this leads into the cycle. The life cycle of a commercial project is very long, relatively speaking. A fast project, soup to nuts, would be 12 months. And then we had projects at Continental that dragged out 8 years, where they would dig into it and then put it on the shelf, and then dig into it and put it on the shelf, and then finally pull the trigger. So you have to be patient, and you have to recognize that, hey, even though they're ready to go today, it could change tomorrow, and just be consistent about following up with them regularly, not annoying them, of course, but staying in touch, because that day is going to come when every commercial roof, Joe, in America will have a clean energy facility on it. Just a question of time.
Yeah, no, it just makes sense. It just makes sense, and energy is not getting any cheaper. Now, I'm curious, you touched on financing and CapEx. I'm curious, what percentage of these commercial projects is the customer providing their own financing or coming to the table with cash versus the solar developer or the solar contractor providing a financing option?
That's a good question. And I'm sure there's tremendous regional variability. Here in Illinois, upwards of 50% of the projects, the commercial projects, are being self-financed, I would argue. And then you have traditional commercial banks that are financing these projects. Every super regional and super regional and up type of bank is used to doing clean energy projects now. And then you have your specialty finance companies like Sunstone, for example, in the commercial space. In resi, you might be familiar with SunGage, but in commercial, Sunstone has a very compelling product that has low to no upfront out of pocket. They're leveraging things like the ITC to make the deal move forward in a timely manner. And then I'm fond of some tools. The LOI is the best tool that I ever, frankly, used in commercial sales. And that is, you break the project into bite-sized chunks. And so while the project may be a $500,000 project, you're trying to get a contract for $50,000 to pay for the initial engineering, design, and interconnection work so that a project can get real viability. Because in Illinois, you have to have an interconnection agreement and you have to have a rec award generally for behind the meter work to really get the green button on let's go. And that takes money. And you don't want to take that risk as an installer. And a lot of installers are taking that risk and it's unnecessary. And I think it just doesn't show enough commitment on somebody's part to say, oh, sure, we'll do it if you do all this free work on the front end. There's no guarantee that once you get that IA, as we call it, the interconnection agreement, and even the rec award, that it's going to happen if they don't have some skin in the game. So I like breaking it down to a smaller bite-sized chunk. And then of course you have the PPA world, and there's lots and lots of providers. And if you reach out to me, I can give you some good PPA providers. Conductor Solar is one of my favorite. I've had their CEO on the show a couple of times, and they're working in the community solar space and the large CNI space.
Got it. And for those that might not be familiar with the terminology, PPA, you're talking about a power purchase agreement, essentially a lease, correct? Or an agreement to purchase electricity from the solar system owner as opposed to from the power company?
Yeah, leases and PPAs are different. A PPA is a power purchase agreement, and so today the customer's paying, in Illinois, maybe 10 cents, maybe 6 cents. Power can be very cheap for commercial off-takers. And then you're going to say to them, hey, Mr. Customer, I can offer you a solar PPA at 5 cents. You'll save 10% off your power bill with no money down. I have a provider who's going to own that solar asset. And we call these companies IPPs, independent power producers. They're a form of utility, but they're specialty utilities that specialize in solar, wind, and batteries. And they're running around owning, deploying, and then operating these solar assets at scale in distributed portfolios. So say Illinois now has 100,000 commercial rooftop projects that are PPAs, and a small handful of IPPs own those solar assets, are operating them, and they're incentivized to operate them because they don't get revenue if those projects aren't producing kWh, because the host gets a power bill from the IPP. So they're getting a power bill from ComEd or Ameren, the investor-owned utility, and then they're getting a second power bill for the kWh that the solar array is producing, and they've greatly reduced their power bill with the solar array. You can reduce your consumption, the actual kWh, by 100%. You'll actually reduce the power bill by a much smaller percent. And then if you install solar, the rule of thumb we use in Illinois is you can reduce your bill by 50 to 75% by owning the array. And then in a PPA or a lease, you might save 10% off that. So either way, you're saving money. It's just a question of how you're skinning that cat.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about on the other side of the solar sales transaction? What should a solar sales rep expect in terms of the sales process, timeline, commission structure, commission potential? How does that differ on the commercial and industrial side?
Well, compensation is all over the map, Joe. It's good, bad, ugly. And there are certainly companies that are offering their sales force a commission-only structure, and I would highly discourage that. I don't think it's good for the company. I don't think it's good for the sales team. I'm fond of a base salary plus commission, and then that commission could be a percentage of sales. That would be the typical way, the most typical way. It could also be a percentage of profit, which is more complicated, puts more risk on the salesperson because it depends on how profitably a company can actually deliver projects then. And as you know, there are different types of contractors. Some of them are self-performing, some of them are subcontracting the work. At Continental, we self-performed, and we had a very high confidence, in delivering the goods at a price that we were bidding it at, and so that was fine. But in general, base plus commission, and then those commissions could go up to 10% if the owner of the company is generous. And I'm fond of being generous with your sales team because it's a win-win. There's a lot of churn in the solar industry, Joe. The average lifespan of an employee in solar, I think, is 18 months, which is not long. You want your team to stick around if they're good, right? You want to be slow to hire and quick to fire, and build a good team and compensate them generously so that they're there for 20 years and can help you grow that snowball. Because like I said at the beginning, this is a 30-year growth trajectory we're on here in the US, and money is just flowing into solar, wind, and batteries now. There's no stopping it. The Trump administration isn't going to stop it. The happy days are here. The technology adoption curve is really what's driving this, right? The cost of solar is lower than coal and gas and nuclear. And so the utilities are investing in it, the IPPs are investing in it, and consumers are investing in it.
Yep. It just makes a lot of sense. Now, one challenge that we have had on the residential side of things, particularly in the last 2 years with a number of the contractors failing, is this issue of, well, how do we guarantee that the system actually remains functional over the entire 20 or 30 year period of performance, right? A lot of times the solar investment is justified based on a very long-term energy production forecast. I would imagine commercial and industrial owners are demanding some sort of, greater guarantee in terms of long-term operation and maintenance than maybe what we see on the residential side. What can you speak about that, and what should a contractor prepare for as far as owning the system after the install?
Yeah, I'm fond of O&M agreements. You want your customers to engage in an operations and maintenance agreement. Solar arrays, while many times they are set it and forget it, need regular maintenance to make sure that the connections are good, that the inverter is healthy and isn't about to fail, that the array is kept clean and is operating optimally. There are studies that show that, some relatively high percentage of productivity from the solar industry is lost for a variety of reasons: soiling, inverter failure, etc., up to, I think, 9%. And so you definitely want customers to understand that these facilities, just like their HVAC equipment needs a regular annual checkup, so does the solar facility. That costs money. You want that to be codified in an agreement. I don't know. Was there another part to that question, and did I answer that?
Well, yeah, I think I really was getting at, how can commercial solar owners have peace of mind that when they make this investment, the system is going to function, for 30 years. But the main point is, how can a commercial solar system owner invest with confidence and know that that system is going to produce over the entire 30-year life of the investment?
Great. So it depends on how the deal is structured, who has what incentives. In Illinois, when a system is turned on, you have to put away 5% of the renewable energy credits, for example, as a deposit. And that is an incentive to the facility owner, whether it's a third-party IPP or the host that could own the array, right? It incentivizes them to keep it operational for 15 years because it's a significant chunk of change that they then get back at the end of those 15 years. So that's one thing, is legislatively to create a floor. And that does generally work. And then the other thing is to engage in regular monitoring of your project. Every commercial inverter manufacturer has a portal that you can just log into, whatever that is, whether it's CPS or SolarEdge. You can take a regular look at what your array is doing, but I would engage a third-party contractor, either the installer or a specialty O&M company. Omnidian is one of these that does nothing but O&M as a business model, and then they're monitoring it and getting an email whenever there's a flag that oh, something needs to be checked either, remotely or with a truck roll. That's really the only way to guarantee that your array is gonna be optimally performing. And then there are great platforms like watch.io, who I've had on the show, wattch.io. Check that out, which is using like machine learning to um, make monitoring easier for humans to understand, especially if you've got like a fleet of assets that you're monitoring. But I say just log into your inverter, keep an eye on it, but more importantly, engage in an O&M contract.
All right, great, great. Tim, when we last spoke, there was another trend that you had mentioned to me, and I'd like to get your take on it. But you said that there is a trend away from central inverters to string inverters. I know you mentioned Solar Edge and CPS just a moment ago. Can you tell us a little bit more about this trend of moving from larger central inverters to more decentralized string inverters for commercial install?
Absolutely. And this is especially true at the utility scale. So the megawatt plus, up to hundreds of megawatts now. Joe, historically, let's say you had a 5 megawatt project, which is at the smaller end of utility scale. But if you had a 5 megawatt project, historically, you might have used 2 or 2.5 megawatt inverters. Now you have these string inverters that are 250, 275, or 350 kW that you can use on a project like that. And so you have many more inverters. Sometimes you will still centralize them in what's called a virtual centralized design, where you're putting them on a skid. So in terms of O&M, it's still just you're going to that skid, and then you can replace the inverter or even a card or a part from within one of the string inverters. And the advantages of this is that when there's a failure, you're only losing a few strings and not an entire chunk of your array or possibly your entire array. And so historically, the trade-off has been that the CapEx is slightly higher to go string on a utility scale project, but the OpEx with string is lower. If you look to the future, which means going to Europe or Asia, because those markets are further along, you will see that 90% of utility scale solar is being done with string inverters. And what that means is that CapEx OpEx equation has run its course, and the industry has decided this is going to be more efficient to use string inverters. And we see that uptake happening, but it's happening slowly. You get in a habit with your design and engineering of relying on certain types of equipment. And then there are manufacturers that manufacture both string inverters and central inverters. CPS and SolarEdge are not those companies. They are both dedicated to the string or micro space. And it's a good thing for large scale. So if you're doing large rooftop solar, reach out to me, because it is kind of apples and oranges. The equipment is different, the inverters, the racking, the modules, and the proposal and cash flow tools as well, which is something I work a lot on with my clients.
Great, great. Well, Tim, where do you see this technology going in the future?
Well, ultimately, I think building integrated PV, which you've covered on your show, is the bee's knees. And it's just a matter of time. With commercial flat roofing, we don't really have a good BIPV solution yet. In the shingle roofing space, you've seen GAF and the Tesla solar roof, move into that market. And it's just a little expensive still. The aesthetic experience with the Tesla roof is amazing, but you talk to contractors and they're not crazy about that product. And then for consumers, it's also quite expensive. But I do think that eventually we will design roofing materials that have integrated solar. There are some like racking integrated with the roofing solutions. I can't remember the name right now that I'm thinking of, but so that's one thing, is that this integration, and that's true for residential and commercial. And then I think a trend towards vertical solar, where you're putting it in the cladding of the building. You do see this in Europe. You could do a high rise or a apartment building, you can imagine, right, where the siding of the building or the glass in the building has PV integrated into it. And that's a thing. And as that cost of technology comes down, that is definitely going to get uptake. And in 20 years, Joe, I think it'll be ubiquitous.
Amazing. Yep. I can't wait to see where this is going. I definitely feel like the time is here. The technology is mature, and it just makes sense. So Tim, for those that would like to get in touch with you, perhaps if they're interested in working with the Clean Power Consulting Group, or they'd like to get in touch with you personally, what's the best way for them to reach out?
I love networking on LinkedIn. Just reach out to me, Tim Montague, on LinkedIn. You can also go to my website. Cleanpowerhour.com is my main website. You'll find links to connect with me there. You'll also see links to my events. I do host regular webinars, and I'm going to lots of trade shows this year, Joe. I'm going to Intersolar in San Diego. I'm going to RE Plus Northeast. I'll be at RE Plus Midwest, of course. So many conferences. So reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I look forward to hearing from you.
That's great, Tim. Hopefully I can connect with you in San Diego. Solar Surge will be out there covering Intersolar North America in San Diego. And we actually will be at the NABCEP Continuing Education Conference as well. I'm not sure if that one's on your list, but we'll
is.
be out
I will
there.
be going there for the first time this year in Reno, I believe, right?
I believe so. Yep. It'll be the first time for us as well, but I think those are the big three: Intersolar, RE Plus, and NABCEP. Of course, a lot of our audience are solar installers. We want to make sure we keep them up to date with all the latest developments and information. But that pretty much does it for today's episode. Again, we've been joined today by Tim Montague. He's the president and owner of the Clean Power Consulting Group, as well as the host of the Clean Power Hour podcast. So go ahead and check that out if you haven't seen his podcast already. A lot of great solar industry information and solar industry leaders, particularly on the commercial side of the business. So Tim, thank you for spending some time this afternoon with us, and I hope to have you on the podcast again, or do some content creation sometime in the future.
Thank you, Joe. I look forward to having you on the Clean Power Hour.
All right, we'll have to make that happen. All right, folks, that does it for today's episode. Thank you for spending some more time on the Solar Surge podcast channel. And as always, I'm Joe Ordia here, encouraging you to get prepared and be empowered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode.